This is Briley Singer, and today we are going to be talking about industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism, and how they have positive and negative effects on progress and individualism. So my aspects of modernity I'm going to be talking about today are progress and individualism. So jumping right into it, um, industrialization affected progress because the world would not be as industrialized if it weren't for Britain. So Britain rewrote how the world perceived industrialization. So some of the things that Britain did was it created access to cheap cotton from colonies, Compton's spinning mule, power loom, innovations like the steam engine and iron, railroads, factories. And so due to all of these advancements in industrialization, Britain created new job opportunities for their people. But one thing that they did that was unique is that they kept it a secret from other nations because they felt that their industrialization made them more superior to other nations because they were progressing at a faster rate. Um, but then once people started finding out about how advanced Britain was, they wanted to be like Britain because at the time Britain was one of the greatest nations because of all of their advances with technology, especially with the steam engine and how they were using iron and the factories as well because factories were definitely a new thing. So then once other countries found out about this, it started booming in their own. Um, so it created a lot of jobs because they needed workers for all of these jobs. And all of the European Union governments attempted to limit the spread of industrialization in developing countries and their own colonies because, again, they didn't want other continents to get a hold of this new way of industrializing because Europe wanted to be the greatest continent at the time. Um, but then this also led to the growth of cities, which is definitely something that today we see has a great effect because as the years go on, it shows that people are starting to move more towards cities and less in rural areas, which was a really big flip at the time. And that is largely to do with the creation of factories and the mass industrialization for the time period. And so Brits really affected how our life is today. And they really helped us progress forward with industrialization because, as I said earlier, like there are so many big cities because of Britain's industrialization. So the next aspect we're going to be discussing is nationalism and how it affected progress. So the example I chose for nationalism was the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna tried to instill nationalism, but it digressed all actions previously taken. So, so this was a post-Napoleonic Empire effort led by the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich. And so he created what is called the Congress of Vienna. So a ton of royal families came together and they conjoined and they talked about how they wanted the future of Europe to look. And so what they wanted to do basically was just restore all status quos that had originally been instilled. The issue was, though, that they did not consider local populations, languages, or cultures. So they wanted to essentially recreate what had already happened in the past, but there were many wars and movements that had happened, essentially meaning that they just wanted a repeat in the past. So their whole thing was that they wanted to restore what the French sort of had, their order. And then they also wanted to make it that no country were to be more powerful than another. And I find this concept very interesting because our world is definitely today, it's built on what country is leading in maybe population, what country is leading in their economy. And so this is an interesting thing because I feel like it definitely showed a lot of regression in the minds of the royal families at that time because they were kind of thinking more of like how their nations could band together rather than their nations separately. And so I think this really shows interesting, like it really correlates interestingly with progress because today I feel like many countries are like there's a big divide within countries. It's very country versus country, like which country has, as I said earlier, is most industrialized, has the most high tech apparatuses. It's very interesting how they felt that banding all the European countries together would create some sort of mass Europe progress. Lastly, I'm going to be discussing how imperialism affected progress. So as I said earlier, each of these examples are showing how it had either a positive or negative effect on progress. So just to recap, I felt that Britain definitely had a positive effect on industrialization, and we would not be nearly as technologically advanced as we are now if it weren't for Britain. And the Congress of Vienna had a very negative effect on progress as they were trying to instill values of regressing. Um, so then last one I have is kind of a middle ground area. It's an aspect that leaves kind of a bad taste in some people's mouth because it has to do with the United States and how showed imperialism over other nations at the time. So I have the United States showed imperialism by ruling over foreign lands. So how they did this was they used the Monroe Doctrine, and that basically said that Europe can't imperialize the US, making it quote unquote untouchable, which I think is quite funny that they created a whole document saying that Europe could not imperialize them, and somehow Europe is supposed to follow this Monroe Doctrine, which they actually sort of did. So it was effective in some sense. So also after this, the U.S. overtook some of Mexico. The whole objective of this was they wanted to throw off Spanish rule. So the U.S. banded with other smaller countries that also were opposed to Mexico. Um, and then this war was very quick because it really showed how weak the Spanish's military was. And so the US won very quickly, but there was sort of a catch after the war. And that was that after the war took place, the US took over countries they helped and called them protectorates, which basically, in simple terms, is hey, we fought this war together and now we're going to look after you because you're small and weak, essentially, is what they were saying, in my opinion. So basically, the US kind of destroyed all of their individual governments they had in place, and it now was not officially a state of the US, but kind of operated as a state of the US because um, the US had the overarching say on any law that was put in place there, and this is something that we still see today. At the time, the US had control over Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Panama, which to my knowledge now the Philippines is not a part of the US control, but other areas are. And this showed after this took place, there was a drastic reduction of resources found within these places because the US started taking their natural resources. And there also was a lack of freedom within these territories because, as I said, they lost all of they lost all of their government to the United States since the United States now has overarching power over them. And so I think that this was very important to progress because this is still something that we see today. Like, there are many nations that have been overtaken by larger, especially European nations. And so this was one moment that really showed kind of the US's colors and how they kind of like took over other nations just like the Europeans did. Ultimately, I feel that this sort of imperialism is really damaging as it destroys just a local culture because it just becomes Americanized, or in other country situations becomes a direct affiliate with that country and kind of destroys all local culture. And so I feel that this is definitely a negative effect of progress as nations essentially lose their sense of self. So the next aspect that we are going to be discussing is individualism. And so also using industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism, I'm going to be discussing how different moments in history either had a negative or positive effect on individualism. So jumping right into it, we have industrialization first. And so the example I chose was the Great Leap Forward. And so this was a very dark, dark time in Chinese history. So the Great Leap Forward demonstrates how industrial individualism is key. And so the Great Leap Forward took place in 1958. And so basically what happened was laborers were put to work to produce mass amounts of farming goods. So peasants were forced to work. They didn't really have much of a say. And at first, they didn't really mind it because no matter how much work they did, they were fed and they had a place to stay. And it seemed like a pretty good trade. Though they were kind of bartered off and people were told where to work, and they kind of lost their sense of individualism because the government essentially owned them and could force them to work in whatever conditions they wanted to. And then some issues arose through the Great Leap Forward. This was because they also wanted to increase steel and iron production, and doing this, they melted down things that made the iron non-effective, and so essentially they had a ton of material that they could not sell or could not trade, which caused a massive economic loss. And then the insect population grew out in the fields due to natural predators being scared away by people working. And then also seeds were planted incorrectly, which led to crop loss. And so officials were required to also support the Great Leap, even though the Great Leap clearly was not working and millions were dying. Eventually, the Chinese gave up on the Great Leap Forward, and individuals were given their sense of they were given their farms back, and laborers were allowed to freely work where they wanted to and were no longer forced to work in cruel conditions. So obviously, individualism in industrialization is key because, as shown by the Great Leap Forward, millions were dying, and it is essential for people to have their own choice in whether what conditions they can work under or not, and not be under the governmental control. When discussing individualism, nationalism is something that is very keen too. So I have a sense of nationalism was forced onto other states within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, eliminating their individualism and leading to the collapse of the empire. So the Habsburgs have been ruling for a long time within the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and they did not want to give up power. Though there were many ethnic minorities that lived within the empire, the Hungarians felt that they were better than Slavics because only the Hungarians were granted autonomy by the Austrian government, and so making it Austria-Hungary. But then they also ruled over other nations. So a sense of nationalism was kind of forced onto the people who were living in these smaller, less represented countries. And so, because they were still technically like Austrian Hungarian, but they didn't feel that way because they were still living in the small, underrepresented countries. But the Austrians felt that they should have been grateful because they were under the Austrian-Hungarian rule, which led to a revolt, and obviously the Austrian-Hungarians would come to regret this as they lost out on a lot of land, and the smaller sovereign states that they used to rule over no longer belonged to them because they were not given the same sort of autonomy and representation that the Hungarians were. And then the Hungarians also kind of instilled a sense of nationalism within those smaller governments, as I mentioned earlier, because they felt that they were superior because the Austrians granted them power and rule since the Austrian-Hungarian Empire became a dual monarchy. So nationalism was very important in individualism because it led to, as I said earlier, the revolt of the smaller nations. Lastly, imperialism is something that is very keen when discussing individualism as well. Japan wanted to create Asian imperialism and tried to defend themselves against other European nations. So Japan wanted more oil and rubber and tin. And so at the time, they had really great trade relationships for oil with the Brits, Dutch, and the United States. But Japan felt that they needed a strong military, and so they wanted to create a mass Asian alliance. And so they started creating relations with China, but in doing this, they wanted to damage the US Navy, which in turn caused them to lose out on a lot of their allies. And this is imperialism because they were trying to create one identity across Asia, and they wanted to show that they were more superior than other continents because they banded together, unlike Europe or the Americas at the time. And so in the end, though, they gave up imperial relations to be a part of the global status quo again. All of these examples prove that industrialization, nationalism, and imperialism have positive and negative effects on progress and individualism. and definitely are lessons that we can learn from today, and they help make this modern really only cared about themselves.